Hello and welcome to Arab Center Washington, D.C.'s webinar titled Iraq at the Crossroads, Challenges and Prospects Facing the New Government. My name is Imad Harb and I am the Director of Research and Analysis at Arab Center Washington, D.C. On October 27, 2022, the Iraqi parliament approved a new government headed by Prime Minister Muhammad Al-Sudani. Ministry assignments were distributed to political parties largely through the country's sectarian quota system, with the Shia coalition receiving 12 ministers, the Sunnis receiving 6, and the Kurds receiving 4. However, Shia cleric al-sadr and his Sadrist movement, one of Iraq's most influential political movements, were noticeably absent from the new government, having previously submitted their resignation for parliament in June, leaving most of their seats to be snatched up by Iran allies in the coordination framework. The Iraqi parliament also elected Kurdistan Democratic Party nominee Abdul Latif Rashid as president to succeed Barham Saleh of the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan. The complex dynamics of government formation following more than a year of political gridlock and confrontations have led many to predict division, instability, and challenges ahead. Today, Arab Center Washington, D.C. is hosting a panel of experts to discuss the future of the new Iraqi government and of Sudanese government program, to examine challenges facing the country, including political disagreements, corruption, and disputes between the central government and the autonomous region of Kurdistan, and to assess the government's impact on regional and international relations, and offer policy recommendations for the Biden administration. Considering the Sadrist movement's ability to mobilize protests and its lack of a role in the new government, is Iraq headed for more instability and violence? What is the likelihood that the government will address persistent conditions that sparked mass protests in October 2019? What are the implications for regional dynamics, especially given Iran's involvement in Iraq and its recent attacks in Iraqi Kurdistan? What are the implications of US-Iraq relations, and how can the Biden administration support inclusive and democratic governance in Iraq? I am honored to present a group of experts who will speak in the order I will introduce them. Each will have about 10-11 minutes to present their remarks. The balance of the time will be devoted to a question and answer period. Please submit your questions via the Q&As, the features on your Zoom page, and I will be happy to direct them to a particular panelist or more. You also can submit your questions to events@arabcenterdc.org, events@arabcenterdc.org, and I will convey them to the panelists. Please state your name and be brief in asking the questions so we can accommodate as many questions as possible. Rend Al-Rahim is president and co-founder of the Iraq Foundation, and she is a former Iraqi ambassador to the United States. She will be discussing Iraq's governance and confessional system and corruption in the country, and the challenges facing the new government. Zeidon Alkinani is a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center Washington, D.C., and a doctoral researcher and former teaching assistant on politics and international relations at the University of Aberdeen. He will be discussing the prospects for the new government and its program, specifically addressing the issues of inclusive governance and the conditions that led basically to the protests of 2019. Marsin is the research fellow at the Middle East Institute at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard Kennedy School, and non-resident fellow Center for Middle East Policy at the Brookings Institution. And she will be talking about religion and politics in Iraq, the Shia religious establishment, the implications of the absence of the Sadrists from the new government. Muhanad Seloom is assistant professor in critical security studies at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and honorary research fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter. and he will be discussing the prospects and challenges with focus on security and the challenges facing the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government internally, and its relations with the central government. Shamiran Mako is an assistant professor of international relations at the Frederick Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, and she will be discussing the impact of foreign interventions in Iraq and provide policy recommendations for the US administration. Rend, floor is yours.
So, Imad, thank you very much, and thanks to the Arab Center for the invitation to join the panel. Okay, so what could go wrong in Iraq? Well, this being Iraq, I think a lot could go wrong. The Prime Minister presented a very long and ambitious program, and every item in the program will pose a challenge. The government will be tested on job creation, diversifying the economy, establishing rule of law, combating corruption, building relations with the Kurds and the Sunnis, and of course relations within the region and beyond the region. And of course, there's always the looming challenge that may be mounted by Muhanad al-Sadr, who is not likely to stay outside the political scene for long and is probably biding his time. I'd like to divide the major challenges that I see into three broad categories, and then I will zero in. So the first category is what I would call building trust, popular trust, citizens' trust in the state and in the rule of law. The second one is mending ties or building ties of trust between the Shia political class and their Kurdish and their Sunni counterparts. And the third big sort of broad category is maintaining Iraq's position and relations in the region. But I think the first challenge that we really need to talk about, and it sort of underlies all the other challenges, is for the Prime Minister to determine who has authority in Iraq. And this is becoming increasingly a problematic question. The coordination framework, which is the group of Shia political parties that nominated Sudani as Prime Minister and is giving him the backing, has said repeatedly that it is the architect and the chief decision maker of the current government, the current regime. And effectively, the way they're presenting themselves is as the Politburo of Iraq. So they claim authority to craft policy, lay out strategy, and make decisions to the exclusion of other partners in the political process, to the exclusion of the Kurds and the Sunnis. On the other hand, Mr. Sudani is a moderate and a pragmatist. He was a successful provincial governor, twice a good minister, and all of this gives him political and executive credentials. And there will be tensions. I foresee that there will be tensions between the Prime Minister and the framework. And very quickly, the framework has said that it has imposed restrictions on Sudani, including requiring him to consult the framework on economic, political, and security matters. In public statements, the framework has explicitly said that Sudani is implementer and he is more like a director general who implements the policies of the framework. He has been publicly reprimanded by Al-Maliki for not fulfilling some of the framework's conditions. And so the question is going to arise of who is in charge. Is it the Prime Minister and his cabinet reporting to Parliament, or is it the coordination framework issuing policies and directives and reporting to no one? Not even to their Kurdish and Sunni partners. So this ambiguity is really going to create serious challenges, I think, for Mr. Sudani. Looking at the three broad areas that I identified first, the issue of building the trust in government that is in severe deficit within the public, as we saw in the last elections. And the turnout to the elections was allegedly 41%, but many believe it was much lower. And essentially, the state has no credibility with the government, with the public. So, in my view, corruption is at the core of this issue of trust, and it's at the core of what's wrong in Iraq. Corruption is endemic and has set deep roots in the political system. And tackling corruption has been a major point with Mr. Sudani, and also with the coordination framework in all their speeches and statements. Currently, there are two massive cases of smuggling and embezzlement, which are under investigation. Some people have been apprehended, but these are mid-level officials, businessmen, and basically everybody knows that in these massive cases of corruption, the political class is implicated. You can't have an embezzlement from government funds of $2.5 million without some political cover and some politicians being involved. So, assuming the Sudani is serious about fighting corruption, the first hurdle will be how far his supporters, overseers, that is to say the coordination framework, will allow him to pursue these and other corruption cases, and to what extent they will allow him to pursue them impartially, even if they implicate their own members. This is a very difficult question, and accountability, in order to be credible and in order to build trust, mustn't be seen as a political tool. It must be seen as impartial. It must be seen as credible and convincing in order to be a tool for restoring faith in the government and restoring faith in the rule of law. So I think this is going to be the first challenge, or one of the biggest challenges that faces Sudani. Equally, on the domestic political front, Sudani will have to navigate through clashing wills and agendas within the framework itself, because the framework is just a group of political parties. But more importantly, between the Shia framework and the Kurds and the Sunnis. And we have to keep in mind that the coordination framework was not the first choice of ally for either the KDP or the Sunni Siyada. It was only after Muqtada al-Sadr, months after Muqtada al-Sadr withdrew from parliament, that they acquiesced to a partnership with the framework. So already we have a certain level of distrust and tension. And within the framework, there are groups that have gone out of their way to discredit and undermine the head of Siyada, Muhammad al-Halbusi, who is also Speaker of Parliament. The framework's relation with the KDP is not much better. They've accused the KDP of dealing with Israel and encouraging Iranian Kurds against the Tehran government. And this has been a repeated reprise in the media and the pronouncements of certain members of the framework. So already this issue of lack of trust between allegedly the three partners in the political process is going to be a problem. The three partners forged an agreement prior to forming the government, prior to the formation of the government. And the agreement is a compilation of each group's demands. It's a wish list. The problem is that many of these demands are mutually incompatible. And I would argue that satisfying the Sunni demands will be the most difficult for the new government and for Prime Minister Al-Sudani, precisely because many of the Sunni demands actually clash directly with the interests of the militia groups that dominate the coordination framework. So you can't, if you're satisfying some of the Sunni demands, you're undermining the interests of the popular mobilization forces or the militias. So you've got this tension there. And the failure of the Sudani and the framework to come to terms with the needs and the Sunnis, with the needs of the Kurds and the Sunnis, will in fact throw the political process into renewed turmoil and will undermine the government and may even cause the unraveling of the government of Sudani, opening the door, of course, for Muqtada al-Sadr. Finally, the final big item is the regional. And regionally, I think this government will probably struggle to maintain the ties that were so carefully forged and nurtured by the previous government of Mustafa al-Kadhimi. The success of Sudani in maintaining a balance, in maintaining these good relations with Jordan, Egypt, the GCC countries, as well as Iran and further beyond, is really going to indicate to observers how the coordination framework, again, the sponsor and the overseer of Sudani, sees Iraq's place in the region and sees Iraq's regional role. It is their vision for Iraq's posture in the region that is going to be shown by region relations. Sudani has declared that he wants balanced relations. He has mentioned the GCC in particular. He went to Jordan as his first stop, then Kuwait, and then Iran. And in Iran, he met with Khamenei, Raisi. And in Iran, Sudani reiterated that he wants Iraq to be the regional mediator, the regional convener, to continue with that role that it has established. The question is, to what extent does Sudani really want to do this? And to what extent will the regional framework, the coordination framework, allow him to do it? From the other perspective, the question is, to what extent will the GCC countries, Egypt, Jordan, view the Sudani government and behind it, the Shia coalition of the framework, as a reliable interlocutor? To what extent will the region trust the Sudani government to continue with the many agreements that were signed, especially between Iraq and Jordan and Iraq and Egypt? So to what extent is there trust that Sudani will continue in that path? And will Saudi Arabia, for example, trust the new government to continue with its not mediator role, but convening role between Saudi Arabia and Iran? So the question of how the region perceives this new government and the coordination framework is going to be an issue. As I said, in the meantime, I do not want to touch on Sadr except to say that Sadr is lurking in the background and waiting to see what will happen. My final point is about US policy. What I would suggest, the best posture for the US and the best path is to engage with the Sudani government. And we have already seen the ambassador in Baghdad meeting with Sudani himself, with ministers and so on. And this engagement should be within the parameters of strategic framework agreement. It should not be only about security. It should be about the economy, education, climate, and so on. But that the US should also watch these broad areas that I've tried to outline here and really measure the performance of the new government by measuring the success or failure in meeting these challenges. And my view is, what I suspect, is that everybody, not only the US, but the region, other political parties inside Iraq, and the population at large is adopting a wait and see. It's too soon to draw judgments. but it's not too soon to foresee some of the hurdles and the stumbling blocks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rend. You gave us a lot to think about, a lot to ask questions about. Zeidon, your turn.
Thank you, Imad. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone. Two domestic forces that I would personally consider when looking at the latest governmental formation and how it was aligned with the new and clear public opinion, particularly since the October or Tishreen protest movement. So there are two elements I would look at, and that is the ruling political elite or political class versus the protest movement, including the dissatisfied public that didn't necessarily participate actively with the protest movement, but expressed their support in different ways, indirectly, through social media, or even as a word of mouth, but without protesting on the ground. Now, even the ruling elite itself can be very diverse in its different forces, which includes, of course, the official government, the traditional political powers, the armed groups, and the religious groups, and many different interest groups that are in one way or another interconnected with each of those different types of groups. Now, since the current government was formed following an early election, which of course is the first early elections since post-2003 Iraq's democratic system, and arguably in response and in reaction to the Tishreen protest movement, we must look at how much did the current governmental formation, or briefly the political class, engage with the demands or the priorities of the protest movement. Now, at first, one would argue that resignations and electoral amendments and early elections were taking place in response to the protests. However, these amendments do not really meet the drastic and overarching and popular demands of course, the very leaderless and diverse forces of the Tishreen protest movement. And the reason why I use the term diverse here instead of divided, as I believe the term divided did not really accurately reflect the protest movement for many reasons, which we perhaps can discuss at a later stage. So going back to the amendments, now, while they did not meet the overarching popular demand, which is the systemic change of the political system, with, of course, a main target on the Muhasasa system, the ethnic sectarian quota, which distribute political positions based on the ethnic and sectarian proportionality method, arguably following a consultational democratic framework. However, it's been very clear for the past few years that Iraq's informal consultational system is being exclusively distributed to certain political parties that are also known as being the traditional post-2003 political parties in Iraq. Therefore, it puts us to face two obstacles against the Muhasasa system here. One would be it assumes that Iraq's different communities as being homogeneous groups, and of course ignores the political and ideological and generational and individualistic diversities within those groups. And another element to consider here is that the political parties claiming to represent their respective communities would indirectly enforce their ideologies, whether it be Sunni Islamist, Shia Islamist, or Kurdish patriotism, on their diverse communities, and then mobilize masses based on those labels and put people and ordinary citizens in a positions where they have to engage with that consultational system based on those few labels. Therefore, the governmental reappointments and electoral amendments and early elections under the umbrella of the same political class, driving the same Muhasasa political system and political culture, does not meet the demands of the protest movement and the Iraqi public opinion, which is the public opinion beyond the protest movement, as we previously mentioned, regarding the drastic developments and change that would ensure the end, or at least the gradual end and limitation of the power grip of Iraqi politics and economy by the same traditional political parties that have arguably been draining the country's economy in a power struggle over economic and political resources through the leadership of each respective group. Looking closer into back to the governmental formation by Prime Minister Al-Sudani, that governmental formation, as perhaps briefly mentioned, that governmental formation is at the core of the Muhassasa framework. And if anything, and not in defense of former Prime Minister Kadhimi's government, but Kadhimi's government could have been labeled as a bit less oriented by the Muhassasa framework than Sudani's government. And this reminds us of the last government that was formed under Prime Minister Adil Abdel Mahdi, which was considered as the most consensus Iraqi government since 2003, where most of the traditional political forces were mostly satisfied with their shares of power. And there wasn't a strong opposition towards it by any of the main political leaders, like we witnessed in the years before that during other governmental formations. And this political elitist consensus translated into an even expanded or further gap between the political elite and the ordinary citizens, which resulted into this public anger and frustration towards the shortcomings of poor public services through education, healthcare, infrastructure, electricity, and political sectarianism and security, with things that were at the core of the discourse of the protest movement. Now, back to the current governmental formation, which, as we mentioned, is seen as the most consensus agreement since Tishrin. And this, of course, does not necessarily mean that Prime Minister Sudani's intentions were fully Muhassasa oriented. After all, his political support was pushed by the coordination framework, or singled out or controlled by the coordination framework political parties, since it was faced by a lot of opposition by the Sadrist movement, and the coordination framework was the political force that did nominate Prime Minister Sudani. And of course, we can't deny that Tishrin as a protest movement had three main objectives here. It was ending the Muhassasa, limiting corruption, and ending external interventionism, of course, with a particular focus on Iranian proxy influence in the country. And Iran's biggest ally in the current political scene in Iraq is considered to be the coordination framework. Now, there are many claims that this is a misinterpreted claim because there are certain figures in the coordination framework that are not fully aligned with Iran or have acted in autonomy from them in recent years, such as Al-Hakeem and the former Prime Minister Haidar al-Abadi. And sure, that may be true, but it does not deny the fact that the majority of the other leaders within the coordination framework, such as Hadi al-Amri, Qais al-Khazali, and others, are leading figures of the Iran-aligned political camp in Iraq. Now, beyond assessing the current governmental formation through the lens of the protest movement, Prime Minister Sudani has a long administrative experience in past roles, as previously mentioned by Rend. And he has also addressed corruption directly to director generals of different governmental entities. And now, to be fair in our judgment, only time will tell us how much he will actually implement and act according to his anti-corruption discourse. And finally, there's the Sadrist factor. We don't know how long Muqtada al-Sadr will take a backseat and watch a political system and government functioning without his involvement, or following the failure of his attempts to enforce his rules and conditions for the past years. For instance, the political Kurdish parties, which also witnessed a major intra-group rivalry over the position of the president, and more precisely between, of course, KDP and PUK. However, that was finally and relatively resolved, which ended with the appointment of the current president, Abdulatif Rashid. But as for the Shia Islamist parties, the rift was never resolved, and the current government is formed with mainly the coordination framework's agenda. And that means it's with the absence of the party with the highest electoral results, and that is the Sadrist movement, And this absence will always be an eternal threat to Prime Minister Sudani's government. And we all know that silence from Muqtada al-Sadr has in recent years resulted into moments of strategic planning for a return. For instance, when Sadr visited Iran's supreme leader in September 2019, he then tried to join the Tishreen anti-Muhassasa, anti-Iran political discourse, which took place a month later. Or when he claimed to boycott the early elections in 2021, his movement was busy working on a mobile app for the Sadrist voters to find their candidates in their neighborhoods. Final point would be that time will tell us what the current government and the coordination framework should expect from the Sadrist movement in the coming year or two. One potential political return may be a Sadrist participation in successful electoral performance during the upcoming provincial elections in the governorates. And another may be that perhaps challenging the current government under the umbrella of leading a reform revolution against corruption, which is a common rhetoric utilized by the Sadrist leader. I don't see any reasons why that would stop him from utilizing it again against the new government that is very strategically aligned with the traditional political forces.
Thank you, Zeidon. I guess the Sadrist issue is on wait and see. I guess we'll talk about that later in the Q&A. Marsin.
Thank you, Dr. Imad, and thank you to the Arab Center in Washington for hosting us today. I will continue the conversation that my colleagues have started and touch briefly also on the Sadrists, on the protest movement and civil society, but I'll spend most of my time talking about the Shia religious establishment. So basically, all these actors that I mentioned operate on the periphery of the government and influence the government's outcomes and the environment in which it operates, and they're all important for that reason. If we start with the Shia religious establishment based in Najaf, headed by Grand Ayatollah Sistani, its rhetoric has changed dramatically in the last few years. Immediately after 2003, it faced an unprecedented time in which it wasn't in an antagonistic relationship with the state. For decades, the Shia religious establishment had a bad relationship with the state, particularly the Ba'athist state. And then after that, it ended up being in a completely different position where many of Iraq's leading political figures were members of Shia Islamist parties. And over the years, as they've performed poorly in governance and have invited public anger from their constituents, from the Shia Arabs in southern Iraq, the religious establishment began to pay a price for its association, whether intentional or inadvertent, with the Islamist parties. And so it found itself at a point where its popularity was decreasing and it was becoming more and more alarmed at the fact. And so it's reversed course, and I think the most dramatic presentation of its alignment away from politics is the stance that it took in the 2019 Tishreen protest movement, in which it was protective of the protesters and in which it tried to steer a path towards change through reformist means and through electoral means, and which it succeeded at doing at the time. Since then, the only thing we've seen from Grand Ayatollah Sistani was a statement in, I believe, late September, early October, telling people to participate in the elections and encouraging voting. There's been no meetings with political figures. This is different than before, and a generally much more quiet approach to politics. Of course, there's rumors of things happening behind the scenes and under the surface, but nothing that would invite the public's anger or association of the Shia religious establishment with Islamist parties or with government formation or politicians in general. So Sudani's government actually faces a different environment than his predecessors and even his predecessors from Islamist parties, and that there is no degree of intervention from the religious establishment that can be expected. And in many ways, they're in an environment in which they can expect the religious establishment to be more distant and to be less willing to tolerate things from the government. But at the same time, there are some overtures from not just Sudani's government, but prior to him, Kadhimi, and even prior to him, Adel Abdel Mahdi, that are designed to invoke the goodwill of the Shia religious establishment. An example of that is maintaining advisors that were close to the Shia religious establishment that were assigned during Adil Abd al-Mahdi's time, kept during Mustafa al-Kadhimi's time, and Sudani has still kept them on. So there is this push to keep this relationship going. And, this is something that happens beneath the surface, but I think it is really important to keep in mind. The second actor that I wanted to briefly touch on, and Zeidon has talked about them a little bit as well, is civil society broadly and the protest movement more specifically. Of course, when we talk about Iraqi civil society, the issue is that there's a lot of organizations that are politicized and a lot of ghost organizations that are actually functioning. But if we're talking about a specific subset that's, democracy promoting, human rights promoting, activist advocate organizations that coalesced around the Tishreen movement, we know that they didn't actually organize a movement. They were actually surprised by its strength and momentum, but they are still the actors who cultivated a class of protesters in Iraq and who influenced public opinion in Iraq and who influenced the leadership at the local level or at the street level. So far, these civil society activists have been, operating. There's really been no big protest movements yet. It's very early for any premiership. And Sudani is probably going to expect heightened tensions and trigger points during the summer, but we will have to wait and see. He'll likely have to deliver on service reforms in order to avoid any of these. From other figures on the government side that are important to civil society are the parliamentarians that emerged from the Tishreen movement, those who are independent and also those who are in imtidad, and to an extent, Ishraqat Kanun, but not quite. They have a very difficult task ahead of them in convincing Iraqis to participate in the next election. Convincing Iraqi civil society to participate both as candidates and as voters is going to be their task to do. And I think they will be concentrating on this, but this follows a big debate in Iraq about, is it reform or is it revolution we're after? And finally, of course, we have the Sadrists who, my colleagues mentioned briefly during both their talks, but, the Sadrists, we've seen them abandon their 73 seats after a failure to form a majority government. Since then, Muhanad al-Sadr hasn't really been active in the traditional political sense, but he has been tweeting about the World Cup and about Islamic unity. So we know he's still someone who will use his account or might emerge at any moment. We're not sure what his next move will be, but if there is any protest movement that's organic, I'm ready to make a prediction that they will try to co-opt it. This is something that we normally see them do. I mean, everyone talks about how unpredictable Muhanad al-Sadr is, but his unpredictability is quite predictable in some ways, and that if there's going to be an early election, he'll at first say that he won't participate, and then he'll change his mind later. We've seen this countless times. He'll say he's not involved in politics. He'll go back later. We've seen this before. So we expect this kind of rhetoric from him. We expect co-optation of a protest movement that happens organically. But if we delve deeper into the relationship between him and the existing government right now, I think it's important to mention that it's still contentious, but behind the scenes, there's a lot of overtures that Sudani is making towards the Sadrists, including allowing Sadrist governors to stay in their positions and allowing key Sadrists to maintain their places in the government. And I think this is important because it's important not to humiliate a defeated rival, and it's important in the sense of trying to protect Iraq from further violence and instability. We have to remember that these situations are always more complicated beneath the surface. The political elite will squabble amongst themselves on some issues, but at the end of the day, all of them, including Sadr and including Sadr's early allies, are united to protect a system that empowers them. Sudani's job is not an easy one, and I think as grievances accumulate over the years and over the previous premierships, it becomes harder with time. He is in a good position, an envious position of Iraq having more money than ever before, and he himself having some legislative backing in parliament, which his two predecessors lacked. So sitting here in Baghdad today, I'm trying to be hopeful about small successes in a difficult country, but it is a difficult world generally politically for many other countries. And so I think Iraq has to work with whatever small advantages that we have. And I think Sudani may be positioned to enact some small changes that at the end of the day may serve Iraqis and may stem this current public opinion that is quite tired with the government and the political system in Iraq since 2003. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Marsin, for the half full kind of glass. We certainly hope that there is some hope for the new government and for Iraq. Muhanad, your turn.
Thank you very much, Dr. Imad, and thank you to the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. for inviting us and bringing together this terrific panel. I think Ambassador Rend and Zeidon and Marsin have set the scene already for what's going on inside Iraq. I'm going to look at Iraq through security lens. And looking at Iraq since 2003, Iraq perceives itself right after the invasion as a security issue. The same thing goes for the regional and international actors. The approach adopted by the US to Iraq and its partners, the UK, EU, China, Russia, is that Iraq is a security issue. This framework set the scene to how they interact with the Iraqi government. And this has been consistent since 2003. The problem is, after the rise of ISIS, the Iraqi government itself started to project itself as a security issue for the region and also for the international community, in the hope that it will harness the support of these actors. And to some extent, it has succeeded to get support from the US, EU, and other partners. And at the same time, it also succeeded in getting support, or at least keeping regional actors away from Iraq, from intervening in Iraq, because Iraq had these security issues. Now, the Iraqi government there is a new Iraqi government in Baghdad. As far as the Sudani trips to the region and his statements, his interactions with the international community, especially with the US, the UK, and the EU, and even with Russia, with the Russian ambassador in Baghdad, it seems that the approach has not changed. Sudani's main priority, or at least main topic in dealing with the region and the international community, is security. I think it was mentioned that Sudani's recent visit to Jordan, Kuwait, and to Iran. In Iran, I think his statement with Raisi, he was very clear that the top priority of both countries is fighting terrorism. The issue with I think this will give us the idea that Iraq perceives itself as a security issue, and how the international community perceives Iraq or views Iraq gives us a macro view of the security scene in Iraq. If the international community views Iraq through security lens, the prospects for real economic, educational, cultural support are slim, because these countries will, and they have been, focused on selling Iraq weapons, trying to help Iraq fight these extremist groups, which are not only which are not only a threat to Iraq, but also they are a threat to these countries. That's why they're fighting terrorism elsewhere outside their countries. So their focus would be mostly on selling Iraq weapons, selling Iraq electronic warfare, training Iraqi military personnel and security personnel, etc. I think the implications of how Iraq perceives itself and how the international community views Iraq are going to stay with us for the foreseeable future. On the regional level, if we see, or the meso level, if you like, Iraq's relationship with its neighbors is again largely governed by security concerns and regional competition. The Turkish military recent incursions, and they have been going on for some time now, into the northern parts of Iraq, in the Kurdish region, they have undermined the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iraq. And the relationship, the transactional relationship between Baghdad and Ankara have been more or less framed under security concerns. Turkey, Iraq has concerns when it comes to water security, but the Turkish side, they have their concerns with the PKK and the opposition, their opposition groups based in Iraq. At the same time, they have other issues like the Turkmen community, but these are secondary to their main concern, which is the PKK, especially after the rise of ISIS and the Kurdish elements getting stronger in Syria and Iraq. That is one. If we look on the other side, on the eastern side, we would see that Iran also is bombarding Iraqi cities and chasing off their Kurdish opposition parties like the PJAK, the Life's Party, or an offshoot of the KDP-I, which is KDP of Iran. Now, how Iraq interacts with Turkey and how Iraq interacts with Iran is mostly based under the framework of security. Obviously, the Iraqi government security relationship with the Iranian government is much more complicated. It has a regional dimension, and it has changed over time. Right after 2003, the GCC and other Arab states, they had concerns that Iraq is now a proxy of Iran, is the backyard of the Iranian government. There are still some concerns, but not as much as it used to be between 2003 and say 2012. But still, Iraq interacts with Iran and Syria, trying to build the relationship on security concerns. These countries also, they see Iraq as an opportunity, but also as a security concern. And I'm not going to talk about politics, but these countries, they also have an interest in keeping Iraq weak for historical reasons, if you like. Now, if we look at, the latest incursions from Turkey and from Iranians also, the latest incursions, they have not even made Sadr speak. Sadr usually is outspoken when it comes to Iraq's sovereignty. He did not say a word, which gives you a hint about what is going on inside Iraq politically. I think my colleagues have already outlined the political environment inside Iraq, under Kadhimi and also under the current government, and kind of challenges Iraq is facing. Still, these incursions, they will be the main concern of the current Iraqi government, and this is a long-lasting problem that the Al-Sudani, I'm not sure Al-Sudani would be able to address it, but this issue of Iranian and Turkish incursions or military actions inside Iraq, they have to be, it has to be addressed. I don't see this happening in the near future. I don't think he would do anything now because we did not hear proper condemnation from the current government, neither from the previous government. The ambassador, I think the Iranian ambassador and Turkish ambassadors, they were summoned to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but nothing beyond that. I think Iraq also filed a complaint some time ago against Turkey at the UN Security Council for its incursions, but it was not followed up properly. Now, these incursions, obviously, and they would combine, they would undermine Iraq's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now we look at the domestic security scene. Obviously, Iraq has a very complicated or complex security structure. It has official or like formal security forces, the military, the police force, the intelligence services, etc. It has also semi-formal armed groups such as the Hashd al-Shabi militias, such as the Peshmerga as well. It's the Peshmerga is not a unified military force. Yes, it is semi-formal as well. And then they have the armed groups, which are grouped under something called the resistance groups. Now, how the Iraqi government is going to reconcile and coordinate and deal with all these groups is something that is left to the current government. I'm not sure I agree with my colleague, Ambassador Rend, that there are like the economic and political interests of these groups intersect when it comes to the current formation of the Iraqi government. They crossroads as well, I think, and this will complicate the job of the current Prime Minister. They obviously, these groups, they have economic interests on the ground, they control some areas, and they are interacting with the government to trying to maintain their influence and economic and political gains. When this would end, I'm not sure Al-Sudani is capable of doing that, as also my colleagues have outlined that Al-Sudani, yes, he's the Prime Minister, yes, he has the government, but he's not the real, or if you like, the main boss here. He has, you know, other political parties who have the MPs in the parliament who might actually affect his decisions, even if he wishes to do reforms or to control and unify the security forces in Iraq, in formal, informal, or semi-formal. It would be a hard job for him. Now, so this, you know, what we are looking at is the macro level, where the Iraqi government perceives itself as a security issue. The meso level, if you like, which is the regional dimension, where countries such as Turkey and Iran and even the GCC, they see Iraq as a security issue, despite Iraq's efforts to submit itself or present itself as a mediator, as we have seen in the Baghdad conference, where the Saudis and the Iranians have met, but only on the intelligence services level. Iraq, you know, and now we have a new Prime Minister. There are some doubts that the new Prime Minister might not be able actually to bring together these two parties, because it was about the person. So the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, they saw him as not very close to Iran, so probably the new Prime Minister won't be able to pull this together. Domestically, Iraq has so many issues. I think they are well known. The security structures in Iraq, or the security structure in Iraq is conflict in these groups, these armed groups, which are, you know, they have competing interests inside Iraq, both political and economic. And I see it. It might be very hard for the current Prime Minister to actually reconcile or resolve the security complex in Iraq. We have seen that also during the clashes when Muqtada al-Sadr supporters, if you like, or armed men, they clashed with other groups inside the Green Zone a few months back. The Iraqi formal security services, the army, they were just watching, because everybody is, in one way or another, they're under the government's umbrella. Finally, I want to also just touch upon briefly on the relationship between Baghdad and the KRG, with particular focus on security. Currently, and as my colleagues have mentioned, the approach in Erbil, I just came back from the American Universities Conference in Doha, and the Prime Minister of the KRG was very clear about his support for Al-Sudani's government. Let's wait and see. We have agreed to be part of the current government, and our relationship with Baghdad at the current point is good, and we will support Sudanese government, etc., etc. Now, this is not the full picture, because this is what Erbil says. Now, in Soleimania is a totally different story, because the relationship between Baghdad and Erbil is not very good, to say the least, and they have their own issues. Now, both parties sometimes use Baghdad as leverage against each other. Belfer Talabani, I think today he had an interview with Iraq's report, or Iraq's oil report on their website, and he was very clear about his disagreements with the KRG government in Erbil, and that he would take unilateral action and probably get closer to Baghdad. In the security side, Belfer Talabani has his own, and Soleimani has their own. The PUK, they have their own armed forces, and they can enforce their own rules. So how Baghdad would interact with these with both parties is a question, and it is a challenge for Al-Sudani. I will wrap up now. Thank you very much. I still have a few more points, but happy to flesh these points out in the Q&A.
Thank you, Muhanad. Maybe we can touch on those, in the Q&A, like you said. Shamiran.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Imad, for facilitating this conversation. And thank you to the Arab Center for the invitation to contribute to this really timely discussion, and such an honor to be with my co-panelists. I was asked to speak about the question of foreign intervention in Iraq's sovereignty, and offer some thoughts on that. And I want to start with, getting us to think more broadly about what foreign intervention has produced, which is effectively, really over time, at least since 1990, these kind of multiple sites and forms of fragmentation that have affected in many different ways, both state capacity at the national level and subnational level as well. And if we look towards this kind of longue durée history of what this intervention in its sovereignty has meant, is that it's in many ways, it's actually made it contingent on both regional and international geostrategic interests. And I think in this way, and if we kind of take this like long view of how Iraq's sovereignty has been kind of made contingent, is that its sovereignty over time has, in a de jure sense, has really become conditioned by both external and internal conflicts that have over time, I think, both deconstructed but also reconstituted what Iraqi sovereignty has come to look like. And this has meant that Iraqi elites are not the only arbiters of control, governance, and power. And I think this is something that Muhanad alluded to just a while ago. And I think this in and of itself raises kind of important questions of how we think about sovereignty in Iraq. And I think is one of the most pressing and challenging issues to tackle for the new prime minister, like it's been for prior prime ministers. And in many ways, this is because this question of making Iraq's sovereignty contingent has really created the exact conditions that have exacerbated and continue to exacerbate both domestic conflict between, the subnational government in Iraqi Kurdistan, but also making the country a site of regional interventions, principally, at least over the past 2 decades, from Turkey and Iran. And I'm happy to go into this more in the Q&A, but I think these interventions have really heightened internal fragmentation and weakened state legitimacy, but also signaled to regional powers that foreign interventions can be done with impunity, right? And it's why we see, the fact that Iraq has petitioned Turkish incursions in Iraqi Kurdistan. Especially we saw that really culminate in the death of a dozen or so Iraqi citizens in Doha or in Zakho in July with impunity. And in many respects, these petitions to kind of, stop these interventions in many ways actually fall on deaf ears. And we've seen this happen before. And so I want to highlight 3 ways the US occupation, which is something that I was asked to talk about since 2003, I think in many ways, I see the occupation in 2003 as an inflection point in the ways in which Iraq's both internal and external sovereignty has been changed. In some ways, the 2003 intervention heightened fragmentation and signaled to, again, regional states that Iraq's sovereignty was contingent, and thus meant that these states, principally Iran and Turkey, could pursue their own, geostrategic interests and alter domestic politics in Iraq through coercive interventions and military interventions and different kind of forms of influence on, political parties and coalitions and politicians. 2, I think the intervention in 2003 also on a domestic level really kind of produced these ad hoc mechanisms because of the kind of expedient and in some ways incongruent ways that government formation took hold. It meant that there's these kind of ad hoc mechanisms for addressing key questions relating to federalism, subnational autonomy, and really important questions about resource distribution and allocation, fiscal federalism, oil production, were really kind of left to be determined. And in other kind of comparative examples, these are core issues that should have been addressed through kind of more formalized mechanisms within the constitution, but other legal provisions before elections were held. And so I think that in and of itself has had this kind of long-term impact in the ways in which it's shaped stability, but also conflict between Erbil and Baghdad. And third, this kind of fractured domestic legitimacy has produced areas of limited statehood. And what I mean by that is really these kind of pockets and localities where the state is either absent or its infrastructural and coercive capacity is subservient to competing and really kind of more powerful armed non-state actors. And we see this most notably in sites of the most severe types of interventions, which is in Iraq's disputed territories. These territories that exist between Erbil and Baghdad, where neither the central government nor the subnational government, one, have absolute control, in which case then that leads to competition between the armed kind of coercive branches of the subnational government and Baghdad, but it's also invited different forms of interventions from neighboring states, really primarily Turkey, but also Iran in the way in which the Popular Mobilization Forces have exerted influence on its behalf in these territories as well. And so I want to highlight that Iraq's disputed territories in many ways have become Iraq's Achilles heel, right? Because of its inability to exert its sovereign control, both in its governance capacity and coercive capacity. We've seen that not only are these territories the sites of hybrid governance, but also the sites of persistent regional interventions and instability in Iraq. And if we look at data in terms of mapping and tracking conflict zones inside of Iraq, these territories really stand out. And how do we think about that in terms of bolstering Iraq's capacity in these areas? I think it's interesting. In 2009, UNAMI conducted this really comprehensive study with Iraqi both local stakeholders and those within the regional government, the Kurdistan regional government. And I think that report has been classified, but reigniting some sort of a conflict resolution strategy between Erbil and Baghdad that's mediated by the UN in earnest, I think could be a potential path forward. And so what that's meant is that also for American interests, they've been in some ways conditioned and punctuated by periods of crises, right? The US intervenes when there's a massive kind of military or security crisis. And that in and of itself has reinforced American military presence and intervention in some ways as a containment policy, at least for the past 5 to 10 years or so, and certainly post-ISIS. And I've seen in that sense very little in the way of aiding capacity building and emphasis on governance and bolstering reforms from American policymakers. And in fact, if we look at, for example, USAID data, for military assistance amounted to nearly $500 million in comparison to about 48 million that was allocated to economic support and stabilization, and only about 27 million that was allocated to governance, performance and accountability projects. And so we see this kind of real discrepancy between what the US has prioritized in terms of its military and strategic interests and security interests versus bolstering economic reform and capacity building. And here I really want to reiterate Ambassador Rend's earlier comments about Sudani's potential as an established lawmaker, kind of making him what I think to be, and this was in conversation with Marsin earlier, the only prime minister to serve both as an elected official with this kind of extensive legislative experience, but also one that was, to our knowledge, was never a member of the opposition. So Sudani has remained in Iraq and is one of the only prime ministers to have emerged from Iraq that wasn't a member of the Iraqi opposition in exile. And I think that in some ways actually creates this potential opportunity for how American lawmakers negotiate with a prime minister that could possibly have, a level of legitimacy amongst different, ruling factions and actors in Iraq, whereas, that may be less contentious in some ways than previous prime ministers. And to kind of close, and I'm happy to go more into this in the Q&A, I think American policymakers could also think strategically about how to close the gulf between Baghdad and Erbil. I think what we've seen over the past 2 decades is that bolstering military and coercive power of the national and subnational governments has only heightened fragmentation, and in some ways has actually increased competition over territorial and military control in places like the disputed territories, which again are really kind of sites of where we see Iraq's sovereign territory being challenged the most. In other words, the securitization of this kind of bilateral relationship between Iraq and the United States has impeded reform efforts. And I think this is something Muhanad was alluding to as well, in the ways in which we think about the securitization of Iraq's relevance to the US and regional powers has kind of in real ways trickled down to how ruling elites also view governance through a very kind of securitized lens. And so there needs to be this kind of collective shift in what the US prioritizes, and in the way in which it maybe starts to rethink social capacity building, economic reforms, and bolstering national unity as important mechanisms for strengthening long-term strategic outcomes, because these things inherently mean that they will also strengthen Iraq's domestic stability and sovereign control. Likewise, I think it's important for American short and long-term strategic interests to push towards integrating Iraq's armed forces, particularly the Iraqi security forces, with the Peshmerga. And I realize, I'm not naive in saying this, and I realize that this is really, really difficult to do, given that the Peshmerga itself is divided internally between the KDP and the PUK. And then, of course, there's the added layer that the Peshmerga within the Kurdistan region of Iraq is, operates, I think, on somewhat separate terms from Iraqi security forces. But I think, to both pacify intra-Kurdish rivalry and tensions, and to kind of formalize the Peshmerga as key security actors within the state and subject to the same kind of cooperative oversight mechanisms, could really, create this shift in the ways in which Iraq can exert more sovereign control over its territories. And I think that in and of itself will actually bolster sovereign control at the subnational level for the Kurdistan region, where we see also kind of real sites of intervention along that northern frontier with Turkish incursions. And that's been happening since the 1990s, but we've definitely seen this massive uptick in Kurdish and Turkish airstrikes and so forth, and military presence actually since 2003. And I think right now American policymakers have kind of this siloed approach to placating tensions between the Kurdistan region and Baghdad. And I think there could be more kind of collaborative and cooperative, approaches that could be mediated by the United States in the ways in which Erbil and Baghdad can come together and kind of create more cooperative mechanisms that could bolster Iraqi sovereignty. And in doing so, actually create long-term stability in the Kurdistan region as well. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to kind of go into the Q&A more.
Thank you, Shamiran. Appreciate your comments. A lot to unpack there. We have a number of questions. I have a couple of questions for the panelists, if I may. First, Rend, you talked about cleric al-Sadr. You mentioned something that he won't be waiting for long. He is biding his time. I think in your recent article for Arab Center, you said that basically his resignation from parliament was a strategic error, strategic mistake, which I believe it was. Zeidon gave it probably 2 or 3 years or something, and he said that maybe he will show up in the local elections. What do you mean by biding his time? I mean, when do you, if you can put a time on it, when do you think can he bide his time until?
Well, of course, I have no insight into his timing and his own calendar, so I'm just guessing. I do not agree with Zeidon that he will wait 2 or 3 years. I think that, first of all, he's obviously going to wait for any failures or errors by the new government, and he is going to take advantage of that. His only power right now is street power, so he's not going to wait for spontaneous, organic, popular protests. He can organize and launch protests himself on the street. So I don't think it's going to take 2 or 3 years for him to make a move. The other very important thing to note, and this hasn't been brought up, but I think it's an important fact. There is right now going on what, I'll call it a purge just as a shorthand. There's a massive sort of effort to remove Sadrists and Sadr sympathizers from the security forces, from all from the intelligence and so on, everything that has to do with security apparatus in Iraq. And I think this is going to be, it's going to make Muqtada very, very angry. The other thing that we notice is in the corruption investigations, the framework, the coordination framework is using that as a way to attack Sadr and his appointees. So in a way, they're going after Sadr on multiple levels. And I suspect that this is going to mean that he will move sooner rather than later. I don't think it's a 2 or 3 year situation. And that could be, of course, very destabilizing because he can certainly mobilize hundreds of thousands of people. His problem, of course, is that it was a strategic error. He let down his supporters. He let down his MPs. He was regarded as fickle. So he needs time to build up his base again, the faith of his base in his capabilities. But once he feels he can do that, I think he'll go forward.
Great, thanks, Rend. Marsin, I wanted to just ask about Ayatollah Sistani. I mean, I know this is speculation, total speculation, but who's going to take over from him?
I get this question a lot, and I have some good news on this front as well, in that Najaf has outlived many governments and many regimes and will continue to live on past Grand Ayatollah Sistani. I think, and I don't mean any disrespect to him, he is not an exceptional figure in the sense of being different from other clerics in the religious establishment. He just lived through exceptional times in Iraqi history. Right. Najaf is very good at self-preservation and is very good at creating a class of clerics and socializing them through years of intensive training that will make it very likely that his successor will be chosen in the same way that he came to be the great Marja in Najaf. So there were various names floating around about students and elite clerics who can potentially come after him. Recently, Grand Ayatollah Muhammad Said Al-Hakeem, who passed away, was said to be a potential successor to him, but he ended up passing away before Grand Ayatollah Sistani. But what we'll see likely is a period of succession in which there's going to be maybe 3 to 6 years in which we don't really hear too much about the successor. They don't have the same grip on the public imagination and the same kind of attention. But then after that, the person will start to form, their name, their reputation, and things will continue. I never worry about Najaf's longevity. It's seen much worse than the last 20 years, and it's managed to continue its successorship very efficiently. But yeah, it's a very important question. I agree with that.
I have a question from Aida Al-Rahim. Anyone can get in on this if you know the answer. Basically, she's wondering about the water shortages and the issue of the Euphrates. The drying up of the water, the climate change is affecting everything there. Who has any comments on this? Will Sudani be able to address this issue?
I can comment very briefly and see if anyone else has something to add on. I'm by no means a climate change expert, but I have lived through the sandstorms of the last spring and see how dire the situation is and how quickly we need to respond. The two things I have to say to this is that, first of all, sadly, Sudani's government program doesn't make any mention of climate change, which is deeply alarming. But the other thing that we really need to pay attention to, and I think it was a New York Times article that was written about this recently, is that Iraq is going to pay the price for basically the United States and China's behavior. And there's very little that we can do in terms of policies that can make life more bearable for people in the next 10 years, other than just providing better services. At the end of the day, Iraq is a victim once more of poor planning from the international community or just poor decisions by greater powers. And, you know, of course, there's things that we can do domestically, but we already right now are confronting a crisis with internal displacement that's climate caused. And if you look at IOM's displacement matrix, which has been used for years to track displaced persons due to the ISIS war, it's now shifting towards people who are displaced from climate, who are moving from agricultural areas to urban areas, and who are creating, the unplanned urbanization of certain cities has created quite a challenge in Iraq, and the fact that it's not being treated as a priority is something that I would critique the current government's start on. Perhaps this issue will be raised to them eventually by various advisors, but we'll see how that what happens there.
Yeah. I have a question here that basically alludes to the issue of, okay, all politics and security, all politics and security. What is economic development here? The question basically is, how Iraq can shift the narrative to more about economic development instead of only political and security discussions. Any takers?
Well, it's going to be very tough, but Iraq has to get its house in order first, so that it shifts the conversation from security to economic development, educational development as well. The issue, as we see now, is the Iraqi governments. Even when the US started, or the rumors were spread that the US is withdrawing from the region, the Iraqi political class, they started to fear that they would become irrelevant in this new era where the US is shifting its attention to the east. So they started to promote the idea that, well, we still have issues, ISIS is still alive and kicking, and you need to cooperate with us, we're still relevant. But their focus is basically security, and the issues inside Iraq, they continue. I want to also comment on, so it's getting its house in order. I think that's the best and the most effective way of shifting the conversation so that Iraq can actually talk to its neighbors on these issues. And this is relevant to the previous question, and I have a brief comment on that. I think Iraq has been, for a few years now, dealing or adopting a transactional policy to address the water issue with Turkey. So Turkey has its, as I mentioned earlier, that Turkey has its security concerns in Iraq, and the Iraqi government relationship with these elements is complicated, to say the least, because some of the PKK elements were paid by the Iraqi government. Their salaries at some point were paid by the central government, and now the Iraqi government is also equally has the same relationship with Turkey, helping Turkey get into Iraq to chase these elements. It's looking the other way. It's not taking very much proactive measures to drive these elements out or to control them. So I think what is Iraq current policy is a transactional, so to probably give Turkey some economic incentives in terms of their oil imports, and at the same time to help Turkey realize its security goals in Iraq in terms of clamping down or chasing or hunting down the PKK elements.
Yeah, thank you, Muhanad. Appreciate it. Zeidon, could you just briefly, very, very briefly, just you mentioned something. The opposition or the Tashri movement is diverse, it's not divided. Could you just make a quick explanation of that?
Yes, of course. Well, one of the early signs of the very diverse discourses within the protest movement was that some people preferred reform within the same political system rather than having to go through the drastic development of an overhaul of the political system, whereas the latter seemed to be a bit more popular across different forces of the protest movement. Of course, that is a natural expectation when you are dealing with a protest movement that is mainly led by the youth. Hopes and preferences would be a bit more different than the previous generations. These differences developed in the following months as they were getting closer to the early elections that took place in late 2021, you had Tishrini forces that preferred politically institutionalizing themselves, as one of the questions we're referring to, or preparing themselves, maturing themselves into becoming political entities and parties without participating in the elections, claiming that they would rather have more time and effort into being a part of a change beyond elections, such as Al-Bayt al-Watani. And then you have other political parties, such as Imtidad, which did enter the current parliament under the leadership of Ala al-Rikabi. And then, of course, there are other political forces or youth forces within Tishrin that prefer to maintain the revolutionary or the rebellious aspect of protesting rather than getting involved in the politicization of the movement.
Thank you. Shamiran, I have a question for you on interventions in Iraq and basically, you know, it led to fragmentation of the Iraqi government, of the Iraqi state stuff. I have a problem with it's a state penetration, right? The state has been penetrated, the state institutions, and this has also led to the fragmentation. You know, how can this this paradigm of looking at the state as the one that is going to be protecting Iraq's sovereignty and all this, as the state itself has been penetrated by different elite forces, different actually also outside actors. How does the state reconcile this and make itself, present itself as truly the representative or the protector of Iraq's sovereignty?
Yeah, thank you so much, Imad. That's a really good question. And I think some of my co-panelists have alluded to this in different ways. And I actually see it as, you know, two sides of the same coin. So its internal sovereignty and the kind of legitimacy of the ruling elite is really predicated onto the extent to which they themselves kind of value and protect its own sovereignty, right? I mean, ultimately, I think the way I see it, if there continues to be this kind of big gulf between, for instance, ruling elites in the Kurdistan region and those in Baghdad, we're really not going to see incursions on Iraq's sovereignty stop. And I think, you know, just having been in the northern borderlands, for example, you really don't feel the presence of, you know, Iraqi security actors. And I think what that's meant is that its borders are seen as fluid. And because its borders are seen as fluid, it inherently means and invites in some ways interventions by regional actors who, you know, on the very kind of realpolitik level are pursuing their own interests in the highly, you know, fragmented and weak state. And so I think so much of Iraq's sovereignty ultimately, and I think this is something Muhanad was pointing to, rests on the will of political elites, both at the federal level and the subnational level, to value the existence of the state, you know, in terms of its actual, you know, capacity, rather than it seeing as kind of operating on these two levels. And I think until that happens, we're going to continue to see its, you know, Iraqi elites treat its sovereignty as, you know, one that's up for grabs, but also neighboring states see Iraq as a playing field for their own geostrategic interests, which is effectively what's been happening for the past 2 decades.
Right. Yeah. Zeidon, I have a question from Dr. Abdul-Wahab al-Qassab, our colleague. Do you think that Dr. al-Sadr lost at least a segment of his supporters, at least the intelligent part of it, by taking these sudden decisions, which resulted in bringing back a coalition of corrupt militias in Iraq?
Well, the short answer is yes. The long answer is that the other political, traditional political parties and the common political leaders in post-2003 Iraq have been regularly losing a lot of their following. This was very evident in recent years throughout the different electoral performances. However, the Sadrist movement or the Sadrist leader arguably enjoys a following from many followers that are, in a very metaphorical way, known as blind followers. That is a power that the Sadrist leader enjoys in contrast to many other political and religious leaders in Iraq. We can't also deny the fact that there are many political movements in Iraq that actually derive from the Sadrist movement, not only from his family's side, but even from the early stages of the Iraq new democratic process since 2003 or 2005. Some of them are some of his traditional rivals, such as Asab al-Haq. And of course, in reference to the question by Dr. Abdul Wahab, I think he's referring to many of the intellectual members of the Sadrist movement. Yes, that has been taking place. I personally was in Baghdad in September, and I heard it from people who, from a first-hand experience, are connected with members of the Sadrist movement, and they were told by them that this would be their last time where they would give a chance to the Sadrist movement and to be politically affiliated with him or his movement if he does not insist on forming a government against the pressures of the coordination framework.
Yeah. Muhanad, I'm going to ask this question of you from William Grant. Can Sudani maintain the ties with Iraq's Sunni neighbors that Al-Kadhimi worked hard to establish?
Thank you, Dr. Imad. I think he can if he wants to. The issue now is about his statements, his posture in the region. Yes, he has visited Kuwait, he has visited Jordan, but he's yet to visit any of the major countries and have substantive talks about Iraq's role in the region as a mediator, because his predecessor Al-Kadhimi put Iraq on a position to mediate between Iran and the GCC, and particularly with Saudi Arabia. And it was in Iraq's strategic interest to actually have the two countries meet in Baghdad, and with the hope that at some point they would re-establish their diplomatic relationship. As we all know, that Saudi Arabia and Iran are yet to establish diplomatic relations after they severed these relations, and after I think Iranian demonstrators stormed the Saudi diplomatic mission in Iran, and also the consequent targeting of Saudi oil infrastructure. So the short answer, yes, he can, but would he be willing to do that? Because he would have to invest and to highlight, at least, or to demonstrate to these neighboring countries that Iraq and the current government is actually willing and interested in playing this role as a mediator and not being very close to Iran. Because the main challenge for Sudani is that he's perceived by these states as a client of Iran or very close to Iran. Probably he could dismiss this with meetings in Saudi Arabia, probably a visit to Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question from our colleague Gregory Abdelinian. I don't know exactly who can answer it, but I'll throw it out there. Maybe Shamiran, you can look at it. Given higher oil revenues this year, will Sudani be able to shift resources to rebuild the areas damaged in the anti-IS fight?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. I think the question of reconstruction in Iraq, as it relates to, questions of its fluctuation in oil revenues, et cetera, I think unless there's a real effort at actually looking at reconstruction comprehensively and holistically, I'm not sure if an increase in oil revenues will necessarily mean, boosting reconstruction in areas affected by, most by ISIS's rule, which are Mosul and kind of adjacent communities in the Nineveh Plains and Sinjar, et cetera. I think what we've seen actually, I'm not sure that that's dependent necessarily on oil revenue as much as political will of elites in Baghdad to actually take the grievances of these communities seriously. And I've not really seen that. I didn't see it from the Kadhimi administration. I'm not sure, I hope that Prime Minister Al-Sudani will take this seriously. But the Baghdad Erbil agreement that was signed, a couple of years ago was supposed to kind of usher in this reconstruction effort. But in fact, it just turned out to be this, ad hoc security agreement that's done little to either bolster reconstruction and or rein in the quite powerful armed non-state actors who oftentimes impede reconstruction efforts in Mosul and these kind of adjacent communities in the disputed territories. And so I'm not sure that the question necessarily ties to oil revenues, in as much as the political will of elites in Baghdad and in Erbil to allow these communities to have a stake in what they see as core kind of areas where reconstruction needs to happen. And right now, it's not only been kind of fragmented, but it's been very top down. And I think the same kind of comment goes for international reconstruction efforts, whether it be by the UN or international development agencies. There's been very little, at least when we hear community grievances, very little interaction with actually taking into account what these local communities value. And oftentimes what you hear is, yeah, there's a lot of emphasis on reconstructing religious or ancient destroyed sites, but very little in terms of actually factoring in what local community needs are, right? Which are water, economic development, bolstering the education system, etc. That just really hasn't happened. And I think that question remains whether or not Iraq has a, boost in oil revenues or, or it doesn't.
Yeah, thank you. Marsin, final question for you. Institutions and civil society organizations, the Tishreen movement was a product of that. What's going to happen to them? What do you think will happen under Sudani or in the foreseeable future, so to speak?
An honor to have the last question. Thank you. When it comes to civil society and protest movements in Iraq, the last year and a half, it was a really difficult time for civil society and protesters in Iraq. I've been going to Iraq since 2003, and I've noticed the shifts in freedom of speech and freedom of expression in the country over the years. And, in 2003, there was this big opening where everyone could talk about whoever they want. And over the years, for the most part, you could say anything about anyone, barring some figures and depending on locations. But for the most part, it was an open environment. And I remember doing civil society interviews in 2016 and being able to get very open answers from organizations who were willing to talk to me, willing to put their name, everything out there. And then suddenly, when I was doing the same kind of research in 2020, right after the end of the 2021, that time period, just after the end of the worst part of the pandemic, the environment changed completely and people refused to speak anymore. Civil society activists didn't want to do interviews. They didn't want their organizations named. This is the thing that concerns me the most. Mustafa al-Kadhimi, ironically, for being a journalist, has been the worst for journalists and has been the worst for civil society activists. And he did not even come close to satisfying his promise of getting justice for any of the protesters. And he set this precedent of increased surveillance and an increased environment of fear for activists. And I'm worried that once this is set, it's hard to come back from. So we're still trying to see how the space for civil society looks like and for the protest movement looks like under this new administration, under Sudani, whether there's more protections, whether there is less, whether it's the same, what precedents are kept and what aren't. But I will say, and you said I have the cup half full, I am someone who is very proud of the progress of Iraqi civil society in the last 20 years. They're operating under extremely difficult circumstances. Some of them are organic, some of them are genuinely funded by the West, and I don't think we necessarily need to dismiss them for being funded by the international community. I think they serve different purposes, but I think they have made good progress, and I think they will continue to make good progress going forward. I just hope that the environment they operate in is less repressive than it was in the last 2 years.
Well, thank you very much. We come to the end of our webinar today. Thank you all. Thank you to the panelists for really a very, very rich and informative session. I appreciate the time you gave us for today. Thanks for the audience for sending information, sending questions, and participating with us today. We hope to see you again in other webinars by Arab Center, and look at our work on at www.arabcenterdc.org. And thank you very, very much. Appreciate it.